Okay, so let's talk about adaptive behaviors. As we have been studying, all living things change their alleles over time. Adaptation in biology is a process by which an animal or plant becomes fitted to its environment, is the result of natural selection acting upon heritable genetic variation, is how an organism changes over time to survive in a changing environment. So unicellular adaptations. Prokaryotes, you guys know unicellular organisms, they can evolve very quickly from one generation to the next. Why? Because they reproduce very quickly. And because they're reproducing very quickly, they are mutating at a very high rate. They physically take up DNA from their environment and they physically incorporate that DNA into their system. And they exchange DNA with each other. Factors that allow bacteria to adapt quickly to a changing environment include pollution and our human body changes. Antibiotics. Bacteria that resist an antibiotic, that resistance they pass on to their offspring. Pesticides. Insects can adapt to pesticides, and resistant survivors from that pesticide being sprayed on them, pass that on to their offspring. Vaccines. The flu virus mutates and becomes resistant to last year's vaccine, and they pass that resistance on to their offspring. So how does this affect the immune system? We have two types of immunity. We have active immunity and passive immunity. Active immunity is when your body creates antibodies. And it's creating antibodies because you were exposed to a pathogen. You actually got sick. Passive immunity, that's receiving antibodies from another source. An example would be a mother passing her immunity to her child via the placenta or breast milk, or you going to the hospital and needing IV. But the thing about passive immunity is that it is temporary. It's only as long as the mother is breastfeeding her child. It's only as long as you are receiving those IV fluids from the hospital. So some structures that help unicellular organisms survive. I sent you guys this PowerPoint. So I do want you to click on all of these videos. They're really short videos, some of them less than a minute, and just watch these structures in action. So a contractile vacuole expels excess liquid. It functions in homeostasis in unicellular organisms. Cilia are hair-like structures that move fluids past the organism. Flagella also functions in movement, but it functions in movement with a whip-like tail. A pseudopod is used for movement of the cell and ingesting nutrients. Its projections from, like an amoeba, a unicellular organism, its projections of its cell membrane. And eye spots are light-sensitive areas that help the organism to find better conditions. Some multicellular adaptations. Complex organisms carry out life functions in various environments by adaptations. These adaptations evolved to ensure survival and reproductive success. So some adaptations in plants and animals. So for transport and excretion, in plants, they have vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem. The xylem carries water. The phloem carries the nutrients or food. And in animals, we have vessels, our arteries, our veins. For respiration, the adaptation respiration, plants use both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. In animals, it's just cellular respiration. For nutrition, plants, they're able to make their own food, so we call them autotrophs, so they can make their own food. And animals, we eat the food the autotrophs make or other animals. For reproduction, plants use seeds and pollen to create offspring. Animals have sexual reproduction. It can either be internal or external. Humans, of course, is internal reproduction. A structural adaptation example in plants would be like thorns on a rose, and in animals, mimicry, one species resembling another, or camouflage, blending in with the surroundings. So let's talk about animal behavior. Behavior is the way an organism reacts to or responds to a stimulus, and it's acquired in two ways. You're either born knowing how to do it, which means it's innate, or it's learned, acquired changes in behavior. Learned is acquired changes in behavior. So some examples of innate behavior: suckling. That's the ability to feed or swallow. No one has to teach a baby how to suckle. Imprinting, that's learning based on an early experience, attachment to an object during an animal's life. Migration is changing location annually due to weather patterns. To hibernate is a state of reduced metabolism as animals sleep through the winter. For example, bears hibernate in the winter. And estivation is a state of reduced metabolism also, but it's during the hot summer. An example of estivation would be like frogs or crocodiles. And please click on these videos down here. Learned behaviors. The first one we have is habituation. Habituation is no longer showing a response to a repeated stimulation. We've all done it during third period, especially if you've had a fourth lunch. Sometimes you don't even hear the second and third lunch bell. It becomes a habit. You don't even pay attention to it. Operant conditioning is the same thing as saying trial and error, is learning to behave in a certain way to receive an award or to avoid punishment. Classical conditioning, that's when an animal makes a mental connection between a stimulus and a reward. Insight, an animal uses its experience to respond to something new or problem solving. You guys use your insight every day in math. You don't always go back to math 1, but what you learned in math 1, you incorporate in algebra and geometry. And please watch these videos too. Aggression is protection, dominance, or survival. Territoriality is defending of a physical space. You know how dogs mark their territory. Courtship is a behavior carried out before mating. That behavior can be via a sound, a visual display, a dance. Communication, think about how spring birds communicate, or bees using navigation to tell other bees where the source of the flower fields are located. Taxis is moving towards something an organism needs to survive. If it's phototaxis, anything that starts with photo or has photo in it, it has to do with light. Chemotaxis is movement in response to a chemical stimulus. Think of ants following that pheromone trail. That's chemotaxis. And again, you have some videos on the bottom. A circadian rhythm is a 24-hour cycle of behavior. Think of our sleep patterns. We sleep at night, and in the daytime, we go about doing whatever we need to do. And that's it.